So thanks everyone for joining us today in this series of talks organized by the Institute of Computing, University of Campinas, here in Campinas, São Paulo, and by PUC-Rio, Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This talk is part of what we called Conexão Rio Campinas or Rio Campinas Connection. It's also supported by the Recall AI Artificial Intelligence Lab here in the Institute of Computing, and two hubs of AI, one on cognitive architectures and one on health and well-being. We have the pleasure today to have here Professor Moshe Vardi. He's going to talk about ethics or the lack of ethics in AI. And the interesting part of the discussion is also about what happens when some companies advertise they have ethics, but what they do in practice is a little bit far from ethics. So Professor Vardi is associated with Rice University. He's a distinguished professor in computational engineering at Rice, where he's leading an initiative on technology, culture, and society. His interests focus on automated reasoning, which is a branch of AI with broad applications to computer science in general, including machine learning, database theory, computational complexity theory, knowledge in multi-agent systems, computer-aided verification, and teaching logic across the curriculum. He's also a faculty scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. I remember the first time that I have had the contact with Professor Vardi, it was my first paper in communications of ACM. So it was quite a few years ago, but it was a pleasure to interact, and the whole process of revision was very educative. So Professor Vardi, thank you very much for joining us today. I will stop sharing my screen, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you all for joining me on this Friday afternoon. Let me share the screen. That's a part I'm almost nervous about. Okay, let's go there. Share screen. Where is share screen? Here. Okay, good. This is the part makes me nervous. So I want to talk to you today about ethics in AI, or as somebody said, the lack of it. Because a lot of talk about ethics, so I'm trying to put it in a very broad context. And I'll start the context by just giving kind of very brief history of AI. It goes back to the late 50s. 1958 is typically considered the beginning of research in AI. And at the beginning, the people were very optimistic. How hard can this artificial intelligence thing be? And then Simon and Newell, two pioneers, they said, okay, chess, give us 10 years, we'll do chess. Within a decade, Marvin Minsky was even more ambitious. Within a generation, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will substantially be solved. Well, the problem was a bit more difficult than they thought. And there were periods where there was total disillusionment with AI because it was a field that always overpromised and under-delivered. So in the 70s, there was a period so-called the first AI winter, and then again in the 80s, the second AI winter. In fact, when I was a graduate student, AI had a bad reputation. It's like what we call in English, a snake oil salesman. Always promise, never deliver. But things start changing. Starting from the late 90s, we had several achievements in AI that are considered to be breakthroughs. Okay, the first one was in 1997 when IBM's Deep Blue beat Kasparov in chess. Here you see Kasparov walking away from the table. This was the second game of the tournament. He lost the second game.
Não vai começar, come comidinha.
Please ask everyone to mute themselves. And you see he's walking away kind of disgusted, and he never recovered from that loss, and he lost the tournament. And that was a huge milestone in the history of AI. And then we had in 2011, again, IBM Watson defeated two great Jeopardy players. And then 2016, now it was Google in the lead. AlphaGo beat a Korean Go master in a tournament. So really major accomplishment by AI. In particular, the Go is important because the Go board game is larger than chess, and there are only one type of piece. Okay, they're black and white, so there are no, you don't have variety. So there are many more configuration. So the brute force technique that IBM used in 1997 cannot apply to Go. Go, you cannot search the game tree as deep as you need. So what happened is that AlphaGo used machine learning. So it used tree search technique, but to prune the search tree, it used machine learning. And what it means is that AlphaGo develops intuition for playing the game, because if you ask a Go master, how do you play the game? They have a vague sense of what is a good position and a good move. They have deep intuition. And now AlphaGo has this intuition. And this offers a response to a paradox known as the Polanyi paradox, phrased by the philosopher Polanyi in 1966. Said, look, there are many people who can drive, but you ask them, explain to us exactly when you approach a red light, you push the brake. How do you know exactly how to push the brake? And no, we can't say. We just have a sense of how to do it based on experience, right? We don't want to brake too fast or brake too slow. And so he wrote, we know more than we can tell. The skill of a driver cannot be replaced by a thorough schooling in the theory of the motor car. So the paradox was, if we can't tell how we drive, how can we program a car to drive? And now we know what the answer is. The answer is machine learning. And indeed, within, over the last few years, we've seen many tech companies trying to automate driving. Well, it turns out that it's a bit more difficult than we thought, and we had some unfortunate incidents. We have the Tesla car hitting a concrete barrier in 2019, and there was an investigation, and NSTB, which is a National Transportation Safety Board, it's a government agency, they say, well, the problem was the car. The car was driving semi-autonomously, and the software failed. And in fact, NSTB said in 2020 that unless Tesla made significant changes into autopilot system, there will be more crashes are expected. And then a worse accident also in 2019 was by an Uber car. There was a safety driver on board, but the safety driver was distracted, and a pedestrian was killed. And again, NSTB said Uber did not have a formal safety plan in place. In fact, they have disabled automated braking because it created unpredictable braking. So, but eventually the driver was charged with homicide because apparently the driver, I think, played video game, and Uber, who was really responsible for that, managed to get out with no charges. And so this started the disillusionment. Around 2017-18, the disillusionment with AI started. In fact, in 2016, ProPublica published an expose. So there is software used across the country to predict future criminal, and it is biased against blacks. Now, why is it biased against blacks? Because it learns from the data. And we know that there is a very unfortunate and sad history in the United States of discrimination against blacks. It's in a justice system. So there is a conventional phrase: those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But with machine learning, those who learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And in 2017, a book came out by Cathy O'Neil, Weapons of Math Distractions: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. New York Times wrote a frightening look at how algorithms are increasingly regulating people. And that led to a phenomenon known as the Techlash, as the backlash against technology. Peggy Noonan was a Wall Street Journal columnist, wrote in October 2017. She wrote about gun ownership, and the argument was very weak in my opinion, but it's important to read what she writes. She writes, because all of their personal and financial information got hacked in the latest breach, because our company's real overlords are in Silicon Valley, and appear to be moral Martians who operate on some weird new postmodern wavelengths, and they will be the one programming the robot that will soon take all the jobs. So suddenly we had the technology has received very bad image in the public eye. And the response to that has been, it's an ethics crisis. New York Times wrote in 2018, tech ethical dark side. Boston Globe, ethics crisis. New York Times, we now need CEO, should be something new, chief ethics officer. VentureBeat, a technology publication, tell us about Facebook that funded Institute for AI and Artificial Intelligence with $7.5 million. So Facebook is such an ethical company, it donated $7.5 million to the Technical University of Munich to form Institute for Ethics in AI. Now you can get books on AI ethics. There are philosophers write books on AI ethics. The Vatican issued a Rome call for AI ethics by the Pontifical Academy for Life, and signatories such as Microsoft and IBM and other organizations, and they sign it. The values and principles that we are able to instill in AI will help to establish a framework that regulates and acts as a point for reference for digital ethics. We need AI to be ethical. And companies jump on the bandwagon. So Google says they have a webpage, you can find it on responsible AI practices. And they said the development of AI is creating new opportunities to improve the lives of people around the world, for businesses to healthcare to education. But it's also raising new questions about the best way to build fairness, interpretability, privacy, security into the system. So Google cares very much about ethical AI. And when Facebook issued funded the Institute of Ethics and AI in Munich, the press release says, at Facebook, ensuring the responsible and thoughtful use of AI is foundational to everything we do, from the data label we use to the individual algorithms we build to the system they are part of. So these companies claim to be very, very ethical. But in 2018, a Dutch philosopher, Ben Wagner, wrote an article called Ethics as an Escape from Regulation, from ethics washing to ethics shopping. And I borrowed the phrase ethics shopping from him, ethics washing from him. And in a nutshell, he writes, much of the debate about ethics seems to provide an easy alternative to government regulation. These companies want to talk about ethics because what they're really afraid of is regulation. So let's go deeper into this issue of ethics versus regulation. So let's compare to another big technology. What was the biggest technology of the 20th century? It was the automobile. Computers, of course, are the biggest technology so far of the 20th century, or 21st century, but the 20th century was the century of the automobile. So in 1908, the Ford Model T all over the manufacturing line became the first mass-consumed, mass-produced car. And what did we discover? People get killed by automobiles. So we have spent over 100 years now trying to deal with this. And transportation experts measure it by death. This is this red line here. Okay, death per billion VMT. VMT is on vehicles miles traveled. When you travel a billion miles, how many people die? And you see that early in the 20th century, it was almost 250 people. And now, by 2015, it was less than 10 people, fewer than 10 people. So we have made a dramatic progress in improving the safety of or reducing fatalities as a result of car crashes. And how did we do it? By a whole bunch of measures. We build better cars, we have mirrors, we have anti-lock brakes, we have airbags, we change the city, we have crosswalks, traffic lights, we change the laws, we have DWI, driving while intoxicated. A driver are supposed to get safety training. What did we not do? We didn't say the solution is ethics training for driver. Driver we teach them ethics, so they would know it's unethical to drive too fast. They would know it's unethical to drive while intoxicated. No, we pass laws saying it's illegal to drive fast. it's illegal to drive while intoxicated. So we had public policy. We didn't say it's about ethics. We say it's about public policy. So now I want to contrast it with, for example, using machine learning in the justice system. So in April 2017, the Chief Justice of the United States, John G. Roberts, visited RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he's having a fireside chat with the president of RPI, Shirley Ann Jackson. And she asked him, can you foresee a day when smart machine driven by artificial intelligence says, will assist with courtroom fact-finding, or even more controversially, judicial decision-making? And he said, it's a day that's here, and it's putting a significant strain on how the judiciary goes about doing things. The New York Times described it, an algorithm that grants freedom or takes it away. So the machine learning is already being used in the justice system in many applications, such as bail, sentencing, parole, separating children from parents. And why are we using machine learning? Because these are very difficult decisions for human beings to make. These are profound decisions, huge impact on people's life. So you know what? Why should we make such hard decisions? Let machine learning make the decision. So let's say, and you can find a company such as Northpoint. They have a beautiful website, but advancing justice and embracing community. And who can disagree with advancing justice and embracing community? But the problem is that we have let algorithm makes very human decision. Michel Alexander, New York Times, wrote about it. He said we have a frightening system of incarceration. Jim Crow was a system of laws in the United States. This law was only repealed in the 1960s, during part of the civil rights movement, and this law discriminated against blacks in the United States. And now we have machine learning discriminate against blacks because it learns from history. And Michel Alexander writes, these advanced mathematical models appear colorblind on the surface, but are significantly influenced by pervasive bias in the criminal justice system. And let's use a parable here, just to show how absurd the situation is. Let's imagine that I'm training my dog, Fluffy, to detect risk of recidivism. Recidivism means proclivity towards going back to crime. And this is a major consideration when people get parole. Will they go back to crime? So I trained Fluffy to detect recidivism, and I've taken Fluffy to the federal court system here in Texas. In Acura has been tested. If you take Fluffy to smell someone, and if there's risk of the recidivism, Fluffy barks. If no risk, Fluffy licks. But as you can see, Fluffy is a black box. It does not provide explanations. So should we allow Fluffy to make parole decisions? Should we give Fluffy ethics training? Now, of course, it's ridiculous. But how is Fluffy different than a black box of machine learning? I claim it's not much different. It's a black box. We don't understand what's happening inside. And the unfortunate thing about Justice Roberts, he's the chief regulator of the federal court systems. It's his job to regulate. And unfortunately, right now, this machine learning in the system is unregulated. In 2018, Jim Larus and Chris Henkin wrote in CSCM about regulating automated decision systems. And they wrote, the disdain for regulation is pervasive throughout the tech industry. In the case of automated decision making, this attitude is mistaken. Why? The widespread adoption of AD system will be economically disruptive and will raise new and complex societal challenges. We shouldn't delegate such big decisions to machines. So I want to take kind of a running example, which is the internet. So let's look at the background for the internet. And when I mean internet, I don't just mean TCP/IP. I mean the whole internet ecosystem, the communication infrastructure. And today, when people talk the internet, they don't mean that. They mean the application running on top of it, the application layer. And the root of this is you go back to the 1980s and you find the roots of today's internet. You find, for example, the whale, which was a dial-up bulletin board. And if you're old enough, you may remember Usenet, which was, again, social media, early social media, Unix to Unix discussion board. And the culture of the time was the so-called counterculture. It came just after the 60s, the Vietnam War. It was very anti-government, anti-establishment. You may remember, you've read about the hippies. And out of this anti-establishment movement came the mantra, information wants to be free. Now, information doesn't want anything. Bits don't have a free will, but somehow this became adopted. Oh, we don't want the government to regulate it, so information should be free. But and in fact, when you look at Tim Berners-Lee, when he develops the World Wide Web in the late 80s, it was all about unfettered public sharing of information. The more, the merrier. But if you remember these days, very quickly we had a problem. There was too much information. How do you find information on the web? The first solution was Yahoo had a directory. They said library of catalog, we'll have a directory. Then the internet grew too fast. It didn't scale. The web grew too fast. It didn't scale. People said, no, we need search engines. But the initial search engines were bad. You got really bad order. You have to go page after page after page to find something that's good. And Google came up with a page rank, with a brilliant algorithm, and Google became a huge company. But of course, they had a question. If information is free, how do you monetize free information? How do you make money? And Google said, wait a minute, broadcast television is free. Newspapers are very cheap. How do they do it? Advertising. So they decided the business model will be really advertising. They don't sell you information. They sell advertisement to advertisers. But then we discover that online advertising is very ineffective. And the solution to that was another brilliant idea, micro-targeted advertising. We will target the advertiser to the preference of individual user. And that means we have to collect data of these individual users. In fact, you have no idea how much information Google has on you. You think Google knows maybe everything you do online. No, Google knows everything you do offline. Every time you use your credit card, Google knows about it because the information is available at the credit card company, and Google buys it because they want to know what you buy online and offline. So if you think about machine learning today, you are the subject of machine learning every day now, because targeted advertising is using machine learning to decide what advertisement you're going to see. So here's an example. You can go and write a query, what is Exxon? And what advertisement you're going to see depends on what Google thinks you are. If Google thinks that you are for sustainability, you'll see a beautiful picture about carbon CO2 capturing, and you see beautiful white clouds. But if they think that you're conservative, you're against regulation, you're going to see a petition against regulation. So same search, you're going to see very different advertisement depending what Google thinks you are. And in 2019, an important book came out. It was called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And that's how she nicknamed this whole phenomenon of selling your data. Companies really getting your data and selling your data to advertisers. The Silicon Valley term from this is, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. You are the product. You are not a customer of Google. You are a user of Google. The customers are the advertising companies. And after the January 6th insurrection in the United States, Shoshana Zuboff wrote an article in the New York Times, and she wrote, the coup we are not talking about. She wrote, we can have democracy or we can have surveillance society, but we cannot have both. And by 2021, Tech Magazine wrote a question, are we living in tech dystopia? And most of there were about 10 or 11 responses, and most of them said, yes, we are living in tech dystopia. And here is a cartoon from that. And what you may remember that what happened after the insurrection was that Facebook kicked Trump off Facebook and off Twitter. And you see here that the progressive are thanking big tech, but big tech is now sitting like an octopus on top of the Congress, on top of the Capitol. And Facebook is also using machine learning in a massive way, because Facebook, the machine learning is used for content moderation. What you see on Facebook wall is determined by machine learning. And the goal there is to maximize user engagement. And how to do it? By nano-targeting. What you see is tailored to what Facebook thinks is your perceived interest. And now we are really gradually see that the social media is been made addictive by design. So social media has become addictive, and you have psychologists who design it to be addictive. NYU wrote in February 2021, social media use driven by the search for reward akin to animals seeking food, new study shows. So it's addictive, and it's been designed to be addictive. An extreme case is the relationship of what's happening with technology and children. Richard Fried, a psychologist, wrote in 2018, none of the parents understand that the children and teens' destructive obsession with technology is the predictable consequence of virtually unrecognized merger between the tech industry and psychology. So tech is designed to be addictive. And what is the consequence of this? For example, you look at children between 10 to 14, kids, young teenagers. Suicide rate amongst such children between 2007 and 2017 nearly tripled. So we have deployed this technology, and our children are paying with their life. It is so disturbing to see that we have deployed technology that caused the increase in suicide rate for children and young teenagers. And what is driving it? Well, we don't know exactly. It's hard to run control experiment, but we do know the iPhone was introduced in 2007, and the Facebook iPhone app was introduced in 2008. And so the fact that suicide rate has grown, has tripled among 10 to 14 in the 10 to 14 age group is very likely the result of social media impact on them, and cyberbullying is known to be a major phenomenon. Now, how well has this business model worked for Google, for example, or surveillance capitalism? You can see that it's worked incredibly well. I mean, by 2020, Google made almost $150 billion from advertising, just from advertising. So imagine we take Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the two co-founders of Google, and we send him to the ethics bootcamp, maybe in Munich, in this Institute for AI Ethics. Do you think they're going to back to Mountain View and tell people, oh, we made a mistake, this is unethical, let's stop doing targeted advertising? Of course not. This is incredibly profitable. They may have ethics concerns, but they're not going to do anything about it. And in 2019, let me quote myself, I wrote, if society finds the surveillance business model offensive, then the remedy is public policy in the form of laws and regulation rather than ethics outrage. But remember, Google wants to pretend that it's an ethical company. So Google is stuck between what I call its ethics theater, ethics facade, and an unethical business model. And that led to the Timnit Gebru scandal. So this is from Wired magazine in June of 2021. She was a star engineer who warned that mass AI can spread racism. Google brought her in, then it forced her out. Can big tech take criticism from within? Well, of course, the answer was no, they couldn't. She was fired. In fact, what happened was that she was fired in 2020 because Google management wanted her to withdraw a paper. She said no. Then Google fired another top researcher that tried to support Timnit Gebru. And then there was many other people who were forced to leave Google. And by March of 2021, there was an AI ethics research conference that decided to suspend Google sponsorship. Now Google is saying they're going to stop tracking us across multiple websites. We will see. The basic business model is surveillance. That's a basic business model. So I'm very skeptical of anything that Google say with respect to privacy. Facebook is not different, by the fall of last year, the Facebook paper, there were a lot of paper were leaked from inside Facebook, and the Wall Street Journal wrote an expose about all this paper. And the point is that inside Facebook, they knew. Here, these are quotes from document inside Facebook. We make body image issue worse for 1 in 3 teen girls who are not actually doing what we say we do publicly. Misinformation, toxicity, and violent content are inordinately prevalent among researchers. An unfortunate side effect is that harmful and misinformative content can go viral, often before we can catch it and mitigate its effects. So inside Facebook, they knew about this issue, but what does Mark Zuckerberg really care about? Profits. But we need to understand the issue is just bigger than just privacy issues. Are these services, we think I get Facebook and Google for free. Are they really free? Well, how does Google make $150 billion from advertising? Where does the money come from? So you say, it's from advertising. No, wait a minute. Where do the advertisement get the money? Alex Webb of Bloomberg wrote, the whole web pays for Google and Facebook to be free, and it should be free in quotes. Because the reality is, consumer ultimately pay the price, because advertisers pass the cost to their clients, and they pass the cost to consumers. So there is an invisible tax on everything we buy, and that tax goes to Google and Facebook, but in a totally opaque way. And so we got mass surveillance to get these free services. And what you'll hear from the industry is, well, people give their data willingly for free services. The answer is very few people are fully aware of how much data the tech company has on them. For example, if you go on Facebook and you go down enough in the menus, you can find that Facebook has a profile on you. Well, about 75% of users do not know that Facebook maintains a profile of them. When you show them the profile, they become very uncomfortable. The majority are uncomfortable, and a significant portion say, no, that's not me. So, let's take this audience here, okay? So we have over 60 people here. If I ask you, do you use Gmail? I bet that over 90% people say, yes, I've used Gmail. It's very convenient. Then I ask you, but every time you use Gmail, you agree to the terms of services. Have you read the terms of services? And I would bet that among the 90+% of the people who do use Gmail, 90+% never read the terms of services. You have no idea what rights you gave Google. So some people call it the con of consent. There is official formal consents, but in reality is we have no idea what rights we gave Google. And beyond that, take it at Google's IP. Google has patents. Or they protected IP incredibly well. Why? Because it's very valuable for them. But what about the IP, the rest of IP? So the point is, if you are newspapers today are going out of business because people think it should be free, I shouldn't pay for that. So the idea is that information is something that people should pay for. It's gone out of the way. No, people aren't willing to pay for anything. Especially ARC students today. They have no concept of copyright and trying to maintain copyrights. So Google and Facebook have destroyed the information market. And I describe it in 2010. I wrote how the hippie destroyed the internet. But if you think about this issue, you can agree or disagree with me on that. But clearly, this is not an issue of ethics. This should be an issue of public policy. Do we want to have an information market? What kind of information market do we want to be? It's not an ethical issue. It should be a policy issue. So let's talk about policy. There is very little IT policy. Why? Well, one reason that we have a huge tech industry. In January of this year, I made an estimate. What is the market capitalization of the big top 5, which is Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook? It was around $10 trillion in market capitalization. It was at least 1/3 of the S&P 500, which is the top 500 companies in the United States. Their estimated 2021 revenue was close to $1.5 trillion. And this powerful industry with huge amount of of money, has lobbied vigorously against any regulation under the mantra regulation stifles innovation. For example, in 2018, Elon Musk was accused of trying to manipulate Tesla's stock price by tweeters, and the investigation was started against him. And Wired magazine, a very techy magazine, jumped the case again. Elon Musk will chill innovation. So Elon Musk should be able to violate the law, because otherwise we would stifle innovation. This is the conventional wisdom of Silicon Valley. But it's not just the industry. I would say there is something, even the whole tech community. There is this what I call techno utopian culture, and it was to me it was put forward by John Perry Barlow in 1996 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And this is the opening sentence. Government of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of the mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past, leave us alone. So this should be completely unregulated. It's the home of the mind. So this kind of utopian culture then somehow assume that what happened in cyberspace stays in cyberspace. But we understand today that this is not what happened in cyberspace does not stay in cyberspace. For example, could there be a cyber attack on the US power grid, on any country's power grid? The answer is a distinct possibility. In fact, the Wall Street Journal did an investigation, and there were Russian footprints in America's electrical grid. Some of the big providers have very good cybersecurity, but there are some small providers, and there seem to be attempts to penetrate them just to experiment with it. There has been no attack yet, but it's not out of the question such attack may happen. And this utopian culture gave rise later to the so-called disruption culture. So in 1995, Clayton Christensen, a business professor in Harvard, coined the phrase disruptive innovation, which was a process by which you have a new technology or a product, and it disrupts the old technology. And he gave an example of disk drive technology. So today disk drives are yeah big, but way back they were at some point yeah big, and they got smaller every time you need new technology to make it smaller. And every time there was a new company with new technology which disrupted the previous companies. Now Christensen was descriptive. He said, this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing disruption. But now disruption has become a Silicon Valley mantra. Let's disrupt. And Victoria Hefferman in New York Times in 2020 wrote, ennobling destruction and sabotage makes the most brutal form of capitalism seems like God will, like it's a good thing to disrupt. And from disruptive, we went to breaking. So Facebook until 2014, their motto was move fast and break things. Unless you're breaking stuff, you are not moving fast enough. Now, breaking what? Well, if they want to bring the payroll system, I don't care. But now we know that Facebook frictionless sharing led to massive dissemination of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and extreme content. And now we know that social media played a key role in many bad things that happened. And remember, Facebook knew about it. But insiders said Facebook CEO chose growth over safety. Growth over safety. And what does the breaking things lead to? It led to the Capitol insurrection in January 6 of 2029. The United States was very, very close to losing its democracy on this day. The details are there is a congressional investigation. When the report will become public, I expect to be shocking, utterly shocking. Now, some people said the solution to that should be corporate responsibility. So let's talk a little bit about corporate responsibilities. What is corporate responsibility? Well, if you go and look what is the definition, you look at the business literature, it's a form of social responsibility. Companies said we're willing to sacrifice some profits for social goals. If you went to a CEO in the 1960s and you ask him, how do you exercise corporate social responsibility? The CEO would tell you, well, I have to balance many stakeholders, my shareholders, my customers, my employees, the community, and I have to balance between all of them. And the CEO will tell you it's a very delicate balance. But what happened in the United States roughly in the early 80s, the dogma has become shareholder values. We don't care about community. We don't care about customers. We don't care about employees. We only care about one thing: make profits so we can enrich the shareholders. And this was based on a very influential article by Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winning economist in 1970. And he wrote the sole responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. Now, by 2019, which is about 50 years later, the Business Roundtable, which is an organization of the top 200 largest US corporations, said this was a big mistake. We need to go back to stakeholders. How well does it work? Yet to be remained. So clearly technology is driving the future, but the question we should ask yourself, who's doing the steering? And the answer right now is tech corporations. Technology has moved very fast, but public policy is lag behind. And again, the mantra would be regulation stifle innovation. But innovation is not a goal by itself. Innovation is just means for societal progress. The real goal should be societal progress. Innovation has to accomplish it. And in September 2020, the New York Times had an article called 50 Years about Milton Friedman. And Applebaum wrote, critics have been fighting ever since to get corporations to acknowledge broader responsibilities. It's the wrong battle. Instead of redefining the role of the corporation, we need to refine the role of the state. And the argument is government remains the most powerful means to express our collective will. Excuse me. The necessary solution is to have laws and regulation that create stronger incentive for good behaviors and laws against bad behavior. So is ethics important? Of course ethics is important. Like the Rome Code says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Of course I agree with this. How can I not agree with it? And ethics should inform public policy. In the 1950s, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, in civilized life, the law floats in a sea of ethics. Ethics is important. Why is ethics important? Because ethics guide us. But the law is institutionalized. Ethics is not. Without laws and regulation, ethics is a subject of philosophy books. What does the law have? We have the justice system. That's what we have. The law is institutionalized. Ethics is not. Now, I teach a course at Rice on computing ethics and society. I want our students to learn about computing and ethics and society. But this is not the way to manage tech corporations. Now, clearly, it's become very clear the regulation is coming. Tim Cook wrote about regulation. We all deserve control of our digital life. That's why we must rein in the data broker. Reuters wrote in January of 2020, Alphabet CEO backs temporary ban on facial recognition tech. Mark Zuckerberg himself says we need regulation. The internet needs new rules. Washington Post, why 2020 would be a watershed year for tech regulation. So even the industry expect a regulation to come. Now, regulation is not easy. I mean, one of the things that you find out that if a country does not have good governance, then regulation. When I gave once a talk about this to an audience in Romania, and Romania we don't have good governance, and I tell them about we need regulation, and people tell me, wait a minute, regulation is an invitation for corruption. So doing regulation is hard. There are different between countries how to regulate. We need some international treaties, and a huge question is big tech too big? And there are some people who argue that we need to make big tech smaller. For example, maybe we should force Facebook to spin off Instagram and WhatsApp. And to me, the biggest policy question is what I would call the social trilemma. Again, New York Times, an article by Emily Bazelon, why is big tech policing speech? Because the government is not. So what is the social trilemma? We're uncomfortable with government doing it. We're uncomfortable with Silicon Valley doing it, but we're also uncomfortable with nobody doing it at all. So we have a real challenge, what to do about social media. And here is just a very recent article, just this month. After the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Facebook broke its own rules to allow for some calls to violence against Russian invaders. So Facebook generally does not allow for call for violence, but Facebook will allow some call for violence against Russian invader. So should Facebook be allowed to call for violence? So this is the social trilemma. Who should regulate speech on the internet? So I want to wrap up. Who drives technology? So the answer is society should drive technology. Tristan Green wrote an article about ethics of AI, and he tried to make it very simple. He said when we discuss ethics of AI, we're asking two simple questions. Is it ethical to build an AI for this specific purpose? Is it ethical to build an AI with these capabilities? And I think this is not enough. I think we also need to ask who benefits and who decides. And I'd like to finish by quoting Kate Crawford, who wrote last year, stop talking about AI ethics. It's time to talk about power. Who wields the power to regulate technology? And I'll finish with the slogan, which is due to BMW. So BMW, their slogan used to be the ultimate driving machine. But now they're threatened by autonomous vehicles. So they changed their slogan. The slogan is don't be driven by technology, drive it. And I think this is a good metaphor for our society. We should not be driven by technology, we should drive it. Thank you very much, and I would be very happy now to start a discussion.
Thanks very much, Professor Vardi. A very nice discussion. The stage was well prepared with several impacting themes, but I would like to start with a question, which is, are you optimistic about the road ahead? What do you see we could do in the next 10 years to improve the scenario that you put here?
So I'll tell you my perspective. I'm a second generation Holocaust survivor. Okay, my mother was in Auschwitz. So I'm very keenly aware that things can become very, very bad. So usually I'm a short-term pessimist. I look now what's happening in Europe, and I think that ahead of us there is some very rough time ahead of us. Okay, this is Russia broke some norms, international norms, grossly with a brutal, barbaric invasion. In response, the West has now applied broke norms in terms of economic sanctions. So rough time are ahead of us. On the other hand, my mother survived Auschwitz, and here I am. So I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. In the long term, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the long arc of history. Things used to be much worse, right? We have slavery. Now we don't have slavery. And it took a long time. Even after slavery, we have 100 years of discrimination, of legal discrimination against blacks in the United States. But eventually it was removed. We still have discrimination. But the long arc of history, I think, goes in the right direction. But that's why it's called the long arc of history. It may take a long time. But we need to remember, it's up to us. We're not passive players in this. That's why I try to teach it to my students. They need to take action. And in particular, I think our students need to think, is it okay to go work for Facebook, for example? And many people say, oh, it's a cool job. And I say, well, is it okay to work for a tobacco company? And many people says, yeah, no, it's legal, but I don't like the idea that I know that cigarettes cause cancer. So I don't want to go for a tobacco company. I think people should have the same image of some of our tech companies. Yes, it's perfectly legal. They make money. It's a well-paying job. It's an interesting technical job. But should you not care about your ethics? What is to me, what is the utmost ethical value? Make the world a better place. So if you're going to work for Facebook, are you making the world a better place? And all computer science students now, they're in great demand. I mean, they are incredibly privileged and fortunate. They can get many different jobs. The unemployment rate among people with a bachelor in computer science is practically zero. Okay, anybody who has the skill to computer science can find jobs. Why should you go work for companies with questionable ethics? And my hope is that people that will reform Facebook and Google will not necessarily by law, but just the people who work there eventually says, I don't want to work in this company. But it will take a while to get this. People are still saying, good jobs, well-paying job, technical, interesting. I'm just a plumber. I'm not responsible for this. We have to change this attitude, I think.
Very good. I give the word to Professor Marcos. He has a question. He is a co-host of our event today. So Marcos, please go ahead.
Moshe, thank you very much for your great talk. It was a pleasure to hear you. I have a question. Your play for regulation is very coherent, but we know that in politics and the regulations are influenced also by lobbying. So how can we solve this? I mean, the big tech companies, they have the money. They can pay or give some advances to the congressman. So how to ensure that the regulation is in terms of the wealth of the society?
So first, I want to quote the U.S. Constitution. It starts the following way: we, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union. Okay? We all live in this world. None of us has perfect life. Anyone, I'll ask you, okay, do you have other imperfection of your life? The answer, of course, this is real life. Of course, it's imperfect. What do you have to do? Well, you have to work to make it a little more perfect. So the fact that something is hard and difficult does not mean we should give up. We should try to make progress. Now, I'm kind of a radical of this. I think that what we need in different countries is a better definition by law of what corporation can do and not do. United States, in fact, went backward. We said, oh, corporations are people. No, they're not people. For example, corporations have limited liability. Why should I have limited liability? I don't have limited liability. If I kill someone, it's my fault, and I may have to pay them millions of dollars. I may go bankrupt. Okay, the court will not say, "Oh, you have limited liability." They'll take everything I have, and beyond that, even after selling my house and everything, I will still owe money. I mean, I may be able to go bankrupt. Okay, but the point is, why should corporations have limited liability? It's a privilege. They get this privilege, they should come with responsibilities. The responsibilities should not be what they would like to have. Stakeholder, shareholder. We as a society, we give them the license to operate as a corporation. We should decide what are their responsibilities. And there is a movement in the United States so there was a decision the corporation can give money, unlimited amount of money to politics. And I think that was it's called Citizen United. It was, I think, a very bad decision. And the way to address it, I think, is by constitutional amendment. But the amendment should not just look at one topic. It should look at what is corporate. We should define. It should not be up to business to define the responsibility. Society gave them the license to operate. Society should tell them what are the terms of this. Okay? And, there are other examples, for example. Imagine that you have somebody who has a business, public business, and they decide, you know what, I don't like black people, so I'm not going to sell them. The answer is no, it's illegal. You have a business. Society tells you there's some certain parameter of the business. You don't have complete freedom. In your house, you could decide, I don't want to have black friends. Okay? You can be racist personally, you can be racist. But if you operate in a public business, no, you cannot do that. So society should define the rights and responsibilities of corporations.
Very good point. And I would like to add one more complication here. When you say that society needs to be aware and enforce this kind of thing, you are assuming that we have an educated society. Educated society in terms of technology and also in general, right? So probably, and I would like to hear you a little bit about this, probably one of the most important things that we could do would be enforce education for everybody. So a more educated people could do the things that we envision them to do, right?
So I think public education, one of the great mandatory public education was one of the great innovation of the 20th century. I mean, it started probably before that, but like high school, that was in the 20th century. I think elementary school was before. I mean, when my father was growing up in Romania in the 1930s, it was mandatory 3 years of elementary education. That was the mandatory, okay, 3 years, which he did not get because they were able to bribe the authority, because he wanted to go to a Jewish school instead. So they bribed the authority and he did not even get that. He was a very intelligent man, but formally he did not receive any elementary education. So unfortunately, now we are seeing some retraction of that. Suddenly we have a movement. Parents should decide what the children should study. And in the name of this freedom, the answer is most places you have some notion of homeschooling. Okay, so we do allow some exception, but what we should not get is the subsidy of public education. The state is paying for public education, and you determine the content of this education. And the reason that we legislated mandatory public education exactly because we believe that for democracy to work, you need educated citizenry. And in fact, the interesting thing is you look at U.S. constitutions. So the U.S. is a democratic republic, but the people who wrote the constitution were nervous about too much democracy. So Karl Popper was a very important philosopher. He wrote a book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And he realized, he was part of the Vienna Circle. And he realized that the same way that Gödel showed us that too much truth leads to contradiction, he showed that too much of many other things leads to contradiction. Too much freedom means that the powerful can oppress the less powerful. Okay? And too much democracy, for example, in the United States, we went for more democracy and more democracy. So we have, for example, we have the primary systems. So before somebody runs for election, the people of the party votes on who should be the candidate. So what happened in the United States is that in presidential election, the participation is relatively low compared to other countries, maybe around 60, in the low 60%. But when you go to primaries, who votes in the primaries? Only people who have very, very strong opinions. So what happened is that more extreme people vote for the primaries. So we end up electing people who tend to be more extreme, either to the right or to the left. In previous time, there was the party decided who would be the candidate, and the party wanted to make sure that they elect candidates that have broad appeal. So we have in some sense our democracy in the United States has deteriorated because we thought, oh, we need more democracy, more democracy, more democracy. It's not a linear function. That's why it's an eternal search for it's a local search. It's a continuous local search for more perfect union. Okay, continuous local search, graduate descent, stochastic graduate descent. This is the best you can hope for.
I have here a question now from Chris Souza. How do you see a possible way to impact tech in a good way with regulation considering increasingly opaque, less than democratic governments?
So again, I mean, the answer is it's going to be hard. You know, there is a famous speech by President Kennedy about going to the moon, and he gave the speech at Rice University in 1963, and he says, we don't go to the moon because it's easy, we go because it is hard. And as a metaphor he used, why does Rice play Texas? It's in the speech, and what he referred to is to football. Well, Rice is not very strong. University of Texas is a powerhouse in football, and we care too much about academics, so our football team is not as strong as Texas. So why does Rice play Texas? Is because you have to be in the fight. Okay, so you know, there is a problem. You know, if you the same issue about openness. If you make government too open, people are afraid. Sometimes there are some discussions that are best done privately. Okay, for example, there are very often in politics you need compromise. But as soon as you compromise, people say, "Oh, you compromise on your principle. Oh my God, you're not standing up to your principle. Boo, boo, boo." The answer is, well, we have different opinions, and the way very often we do this, we go privately and you say, "You know what? I'll compromise on X if you compromise on Y." But if you do it publicly, you cannot do that. So we get up with more extreme opinions. So we think that more openness and more transparency and more democracy is always better. It is not a linear function. We have lost that wisdom. The framework of the Constitution knew that that you have to do democracy carefully. Okay, and we seem to have lost some of this wisdom. That it's a delicate balance between too little democracy and too much democracy. For example, when I came to the United States, I went to California. And California has a political process called the initiative process, where you gather enough signatures and then you bring it to direct vote by the people. Direct vote by people. You bypass the legislature. You bring it to direct vote. It sounds very democratic. I went there, I said, wow, this is amazing. And then it took me a while to realize this is a terrible idea. Why? Because first of all, you need to gather a million signatures. That costs a lot of money. So immediately say only somebody with money can gather the signature. Then you need to reach all the voters. So again, doing publicity for this, you can pass a lot of money. You need a lot of money to advertise this is a state with close to 40 million people. So basically it gave what happened is that organization, mostly corporation with money, were pushing for it.
You favor the rich.
Yeah, it favors the rich. In the name of democracy, we favor the rich. And so we have lost, I think the framer were, on one hand, they were very anti-monarchy, but they also watched the French Revolution. They were worried about the rule of the mob, and they wanted to have, managed democracy. And after that, especially in the 1960s, some of these backroom discussion, people say, no, everything should be open, everything should be transparent, we should vote on everything. And it's not necessarily, I think, has been a, and I'm not a political scientist, so this is just my own personal opinions.
Thank you. I have a question from Professor Marcos.
But I do know about nonlinear optimization.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the presentation. What do you think are the main guidelines to create a good AI regulation? Where should we start discussing?
So, I think that we think we need to regulate AI, but it really is not. Take, for example, automated decision system, okay, where the Chief Justice of the United States says, "Oh, this is happening," and my answer to him, "You're in charge. You can decide what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. You establish the rules. And at the minimum, you can say, before we use any automated decision system, we should be audited. And we should have a discussion. What should be audited for example? Should it have bias? Should it offer explanations? So think of me, okay? I'm a machine learning black box. People ask me all the time to make recommendation. I write lots of recommendation letter. Now suppose that I write a letter and it would say, the letter would say, I have decades of experience in computer science. I recommend that Anderson be promoted. One line letter. What happened? People get the letter and it says, it's a useless letter. You're just telling us up, up, down. Give us an explanation, right? So when I write a letter, the last sentence would be, I recommend this person for promotion, but I'll have a page and a half of explanation why I want this person to be promoted. So we must have explanation. But now we don't have explanation. So we need to figure out we need to regulate not AI per se, but we need to regulate the ecosystem around it, the business processes. Okay. As I said, why did we allow Facebook to buy WhatsApp and Instacart? It's like, you have right now, if you think of Facebook, it's a company that has maybe like 3 billion users between the user for Facebook itself and WhatsApp and Instagram. Okay. So you have about close to 3 billion people, and Facebook has some control over the speech of these people. Who else has this power to control the speech of so many people? No one. I mean, you have China. Okay, we're talking about 1.4 billion people. Mark Zuckerberg, by his policies, controlled the speech of almost 3 billion people. We need to discuss. Do we want to allow that? That's what we need to discuss. It's not getting into the details of the AI. Okay.
Very good. I have a question now from my colleague as well, Professor Paula Costa. Thank you for the very informative talk. As a university professor, my question is, it seems that AI regulation should be strongly based on technical information in a process that has the active participation from computer scientists and engineers. However, it's really hard to attract people from these fields to this type of task. Do you know initiatives on computing schools that deals with this in a way that you think that is interesting? I'm looking for inspiration about how to approach the problem.
So there are some programs that are starting. For example, I think MIT has a master program in tech policy. So the answer is that this program, you need to have some understanding of the technology, and you need to know something about how to do policies, how to do regulation. So one of the students that took the course at Rice, my course at Rice on computing ethics in society, she told me after that she wanted to do a master degree, and really she was going to get a master in computer science. And after taking the course, she said, I'm inspired now to go in a different direction. I'm inspired to go in a direction of tech policy. She's going to write a master program. She's going to get a master degree in tech policy. We need a conversation between technologists and policy people. So I got involved, you mentioned I got involved in a RISE is a think tank for public policy. And I'm getting involved there because I don't have expertise in public policy, but I want to talk to them about bringing my expertise in computing and talk to them about people who expertise in policy. We need to have a conversation because right now we have two groups of people who are not talking to each other. Technologists don't understand policy, and policy thinkers, they're policy makers, which is a whole other story. These are the politicians, but they're policy thinkers. They're people who, they're policy studies. They don't understand the technology. We need to start a conversation. So a few years at Rice, in fact, I had a postdoc that was focused on technology and public policy. And he taught a very nice course at Rice. After he left, unfortunately, we were not able to find the right person to teach it. The course was technology and public policy. And the way we did it, he co-taught it with a computer science PhD student. And every week, and the course was attended half by computer scientists and half from students from other part of the campus. And every week we had two lectures. One lecture was, here is the technology. And the second lecture was, here are the policy impact of this technology. And ACM, for example, now started something called ACM Tech Briefs. It's one word, Tech Briefs, and you can Google it and you'll find. And a tech brief is a memo. It's a few pages. It's a relatively short memo, and it describes a technology, and it talks about the policy implication. And the idea is that this will explain the technology not to technologists, to people outside computer science. Let me explain to you what is face recognition, and let's talk about the policy aspects of face recognition, which is again something that people say we need to regulate face recognition. And so a colleague of mine wrote a blog some years ago. It was called Grow Up Computer Science. Okay, and I recently gave an interview, and I described it. I said the following, using the Star Wars imagery. We think ourselves as the rebels. We're not the rebels anymore. We're not the rebels anymore. We are the empire. Okay, we need to start behaving. We wield tremendous power. And people think, oh, I'm just a nerd, I'm just a programmer. No, what you do changes the world. And we need to assume responsibility for what we have done, and we need to start behaving like that. Other disciplines went to such a moment of, oh my goodness, what have we done? For the chemists, it was World War I and chemical weapons. And they came back, oh my God. For the physicists, it was World War II and the nuclear weapons. Okay? The biologists decided not to wait for such a disaster. And they went in 1975 and they wrote something called the Asilomar Declaration. Okay, they said let's write some rules before something bad happens. It's hard to see the future. Okay, they say predictions are difficult, especially about the future. Okay, we could not foresee how you take this technology. I got into computer science because I enjoyed programming. Okay, that was it. Did I think about, when I wrote a program in Fortran, did I think about how we're going to change the world? It was not, if somebody would describe today's world, it would seem complete science fiction.
Yeah.
And now, there is a British TV series, Black Mirror.
Uh-huh.
And last year, Wired Magazine wrote a review, and they complained. They said Black Mirror used to be dystopian. Now it's realistic.
It's the present. It's true. It's true.
They say we want dystopia. We don't want reality. It's not a reality show. We want dystopia. What happened to the dystopia? Well, the answer is dystopia. We bought the dystopia, right?
I have another question from Marcelo. What can we users do?
This is very difficult. Why? So a colleague of mine, there was an article in CSEM maybe last year or 2 years ago, the consumer versus the citizen. All of us, we are two things. We are citizens. We vote, we elect politicians, and we could choose to vote on politicians that have the right policies, okay? But we're also citizens, okay? So take, for example, you think that I should say, I hate Facebook, so I should boycott Facebook. But I'm a compulsive sharer, okay? I still have a website where when I was a department chair at Rice, first I shared everything by making copies. People say you are wasting too much paper. And so I created my own little website where I posted interesting things. It was, if you go to my website and you do /MISC for miscellaneous, /MISC, you find, and they all stop at some point when there are other ways to share information, okay? And so, so it's very hard, and if I quit, it's not going to change anything. I mean, I'll give you another example. I'm a very devout recycler. But if you ask me why do I recycle, I tell you because it makes me feel good. Does it really does it really do anything for the environment? I'm very skeptical. I have no idea what happened with the stuff I recycle. It probably goes to Africa, into a dump in Africa. I'm skeptical it really gets recycled. Why? Because actual recycling is very expensive. And so it is cheaper to dump it in Africa than to really recycle it. And what happened is everybody just sells it. So the city picks it, my city picks up the recycling for me, They sell it to someone, who 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 knows where does it end up. So the answer is, if we want to make a difference, we have to exercise our citizenship kind of profile, not our, as a consumer, we are all bad because we're addicted to convenience.
Yes.
We're addicted to convenience. And if I tell you, no, give up your convenience, it's just very difficult. Okay?
Yeah.
But it's like telling you, you know what, you can, I can take public transportation to work. So I drive from my home to the university, it's 15 minutes. It would be better for the environment if I took the bus, but it takes 45 minutes in each direction. So convenience wins, always. So, but we are all willing, you know, if on the other hand, if you ask me, are you willing to pay for higher taxes to mitigate, to do carbon capturing? I would say, yes, I'm willing to pay more, okay? But don't take away my convenience from me. So we all have this split personality. We know we have bicameral head, right? We are emotional on one side and rational on the other side. Convenience is the emotional part. We love convenience. But the rational part will say, let's have stricter environmental laws, even if it costs us money.
Mm-hmm.
So
I agree.
So I think we need the answer is, we are not going to have an impact as consumers, but we can have impact as citizens. Okay, you know, tell the politician we want more regulation of technology. Okay.
Very good point. I have now questions from Professor Eduardo and Professor Jacques. They kind of intersect. So it's interesting that you mentioned Citizens United versus FEC. How do you contrast the trends in the EU and the US? Do you think the EU is moving the right direction? And Professor Jacques is pretty much the same question. So how do you contrast the US approach to the ethics problem and the EU approach to the ethics problem?
So, I mean, the US and the UK they have still not fully outgrown the Reagan and Thatcher era, which was the market good, state government is bad. And under the name conservatism, they actually put a very radical policy. They call themselves conservative. What are you conserving? This was a very radical policy, very radical free market policy. And it's actually not based on economics. I mean, it's based on some blind faith in the free market, which is not borne by the theory. Okay, like the free market always give you optimal result. Actually, computer scientists has visited this question, because all we know about the free market, it yields an equilibrium. But you look at equilibrium, there is a prisoner's dilemma, right? We know that there are bad equilibria and good equilibria. And so there's no guarantee, and people have studied this. Kirsten Papadimitriou look at the computational lesson economics, and he showed that it's called the cost of anarchy. You end up in a bad equilibrium, and it'd be very, very expensive. And if you could then negotiate the equilibrium by collective action of society, you end up in a much better equilibrium. Okay, so out of this blind faith, what some people call it market fundamentalism, and we have not outgrown it. They have diminished greatly the power of the states. Europe, other than the UK, did not go through this. Of course, there is another criticism of Europe. Sure, you are very happy to regulate American corporations. And it's true. If Europe had its own powerful tech industry, it's less clear they would have the political will to do that. But I like what Europe is doing. Now you have to understand, stochastic gradual descent. So people say GDPR is very imperfect. Yes, I agree, it's very imperfect. Even experts would tell you there are many flaws in GDPR. The solution should not be to abolish GDPR. Okay? The solution be to improve GDPR. Learn from what happened, look at that and say, a more perfect, what we should ask for is a more perfect regulation. There's no perfect regulation. More perfect regulation. That's what we can hope for. And Europe should do the same. GDPR, we tried it. We tried it for a few years. Let's go back, revisit it, and change if we have to.
Very good. I have now some questions, but we are approaching the end. So I have time for at least one more. Professor Claudia, great talk. A recent book index, The History of shows that an index can induce some sort of view of the underlying information to induce bias from the Greeks onwards. In this sense, do you think that what's happening now is just an amplification of biases that always existed in the way information is organized or indexed?
So I think Google used to use the PageRank. PageRank gave to rank the search result, and that was very good result. The problem was it was not a resilient algorithm. You could manipulate it. In fact, the whole industry arose called search engine optimization. And so Google retired PageRank. And now how they do ranking of search result is a trade secret. But I'm concerned that the way they do that, the algorithm is a black box. But very often what you know about the world is determined by the first page. You want to find something today. What do? You run a Google search and tell me when is the last time you went to page 2 of Google search. So Google has tremendous control over what our epistemic construction of the world is very often determined by that. Now, it used to be, the same issue you can say against any kind of Encyclopedia Britannica. Of course, the editor determined something, but there are more voices now, and the monopoly of Google. When is the last time you ran a Bing search? Okay, I sometimes use when I want to make sure that somebody once asked me about what kind of weapons can you buy in the United States. We know you can buy a gun, but can you buy a machine gun? So I said, okay, I don't know if I can buy a machine gun. I want to run a search, and I thought, gee, I'm going to run a Google search on how do you buy a half an inch Browning machine gun, and the next thing is the FBI will show up at my doorstep. So to run that search, I went to Tor and I used Tor to run that search. Okay, and the answer is yes, you can buy a machine gun in the United States. Okay.
Wow.
But the monopoly of Google. The problem is not just having Google. Of course, any search engine would construct knowledge in some way. But the fact that we have one Google essentially, and it's so dominant, that is a problem. Okay. Now again, Google gives you no control over. You could imagine that there are many different algorithms, and you could go and change some parameters. You say, I'm interested more in this. Okay. I'm dedicated to betterment of the world. So give priority to things that are doing things for the betterment of the world. You have no control over what Google shows you. Okay. And there's one Google, it's their algorithm. That algorithm constructs your epistemic conception of the world. And that's a very bad thing. And this is also partly what Shoshana Zuber talked about is epistemic disparity, she calls it. Okay, they know all about you. You know very little about them. For example, what does Facebook do with the data they collect on you? Do we know? We don't know.
No. To whom they sell.
To whom they sell. We don't know.
Yeah. So, Professor, thank you very much for your time. It was great talking to you, having you here today. And I will end this section asking you one question that pretty much everyone here would like to know. What are your suggestions on how to go next in terms of, I'm a student, for instance, I would like to learn more, read more about this, 1 or 2 books that you could recommend. What are the pointers that you could give students here?
So let me put on the chart, hold on, give me a second. I want to put something on the chart. Let me put it on the chart. So this is a paper that's on my website. And it's a paper that I wrote with a colleague at Rice, and it's called Deep Tech Ethics. It's a short paper, but it's about the course that we teach at Rice. And let me put it on the chart. So we develop a course at RISE, Computing Ethics and Society, and we say, okay, what should be the fundamental focus of the course? What is this tech ethic is about? And our conclusion at the end was that we need to look at how technology affect people, you know, with particular with less power. The people with more power, they take care of themselves. What about the people with less power? And we try to put social justice as part of the discussion. I would put even a broader way, betterment of the world. Okay, what do we do? What's our responsibility for making the world a better place? And we need to start talking to our students about this responsibility that they have. And in particular, as computing professionals, they have awesome power. And they need to take it with responsibility. And the way we can start changing the world is by telling our students that they have a responsibility for making the world a better place.
Very good. That's a very good way of finishing it. Thank you very much. In the name of the Institute of Computing at the University of Campinas, and also the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, here represented by the director, Professor Marcus Endler, I thank you once again for your time and looking forward to have other opportunities to discuss these interesting topics. Thank you very much.
Be safe, be safe, be well.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Obrigado.
Obrigado.